Welcome back. Well, we were talking about load shedding a moment ago, load shedding in politics. Let's talk about load shedding in economics now. Our GDP, our gross domestic product, falling below pre-pandemic levels in the fourth quarter of last year. In other words, our economy is now smaller than it was before the pandemic. 7 out of the 10 categories recording a decline in economic activity over the period. Agriculture and mining, the worst hit.
The other industries, for example, the primary industries in the form of agriculture and mining, they went on a slump. Almost all industries. Transport did try to grow, but they could not offset the contraction of 1.3%. That is the first part. The second issue then comes to the overall numbers of the year 2022, where we have seen our economy growing by 2%. And of course, the biggest contribution came for the year from finance and real estate and business industry, which contributed 0.9 of a percentage point. Of course, it was followed by other areas like transport and trade, which have contributed a lot more positively. Of course, on the expenditure on the GDP or on the economy, we have seen a growth as well for the year 2022 of 2.1%. But there were a lot of speculations. Our job is to go out there and measure.
So, that number again, our economy shrank in the last 3 months of last year by 1.3%, just as the very intense period of load shedding hit. Sifiso Skenjana is an economist, MD of ESG Analytics. He joins us now. Sifiso, thanks for battling the load shedding traffic to get here. Good afternoon. Why was it so bad?
Afternoon, Stephen. I was quite surprised in general, when I kept seeing quite a sense of positive sentiment around our economic outlook. I think when you look at one level beneath the hood, especially at business activity, you would see that whether you're looking at the ABSA PMI, you're looking at the BER ones, etc., we're at below 40 index points for business activity.
And below 50 is positive, so below 40 is a long way down.
It's a long way down, and for a continued period as well, and I think for me that was already giving us a sense around that. The second one, I often say that those quarterly employment statistics tell us something quite interesting about investment behavior of businesses. So when businesses are moving out of full-time employment and giving people more part-time employment, that means that their investment decisions are a little bit more trepidatious in the way they're approaching investment in the economy. And so I think that's one of the things. And so certainly when you just look at all of the leading indicators, for me, I struggled to find kind of good positive nodes. We had seen commodity prices, of course, also falling off. And we had seen also some rains, of course, impacting yields from an agricultural point of view. And so all of those things coming in, for me, I struggled to find then all of the kind of the positive sentiment that was being modeled into the GDP expectation. And of course, now it has come through. And what's quite interesting is that, of course, financial services and business services number. That one, as much as it declined only by 2.3%, it contributes 0.6% to that minus 1.3%. Gives you a sense of activity that is happening at professional services level, what people are buying, what services they're buying. It means also there's no trade activity that is supported by lawyers, bankers, etc. And those are all the things that also, when you look underneath that number, I think gives you a true sense around kind of, a bit of an investment hiatus at this point in time.
So in other words, everyone was too optimistic. If you actually look at what's really going on, we should have expected a big contraction.
We should have, Stephen. And I think even when you look at some of the numbers now, some of the positive, contributions have come from a better than expected household consumption expenditure. But when you look at where the expenditure went, it went into hotels, restauranting, etc. It means people were eating out because of load shedding. And so oftentimes we studied the trend and say when load shedding is peaking, people are eating out. And so that's also going to, I think, translate into what you see in terms of household credit extension, in terms of also the credit default ratios that are going to come through at a household level. And so when you look at those numbers, I think for me, there's really, one, the impact of load shedding that's forcing household expenditure to go outside of the home. as well as then just looking at some of those core sectors. We saw also government expenditure coming down as well, and that's also contributed negatively. So when you look at all of those pieces, I think, Stephen, I think it's still a bit of a tough season for us.
We seem to, if I understood the numbers correctly, maybe I didn't, last week we got figures suggesting that unemployment during the last quarter of last year had decreased slightly. Now, I would have thought that if the economy was growing, the number of people being employed grows. If the economy is shrinking, the number of people being employed is shrinking. It doesn't seem to be happening like that.
Well, the number of ways to look at statistics in general, Stephen, and we were talking offline about revisions and how well those numbers come through, because you've got participation ratios, for example, that come in that give you a sense around how good a number is in terms of the statistical approach that is taken. I think that's the first thing. So oftentimes there may be a miss in terms of the statistics themselves. But I think when you also then look at just how to study employment trends from time to time, there's what we often call underemployment as well, and I think in South Africa that's closer enough to 900,000. And so those are people who are employed but are underutilized for the context of their skills, and I think that's the one thing. The second thing is that when we look at those unemployment numbers, we've got to see the wood for the trees, which are paper fires and which are real fires. Oftentimes these employment stimulus programs that artificially, I think, bloat up those numbers and make it difficult to read in between the lines around are those numbers giving us a sense around what's happening in our economy. Then the last point around that, Stephen, is that we don't really have trickle-down economics in South Africa in the way in which we imagine it. And so we've been able to see, for example, years of jobless growth, right? And so we're seeing economic growth picking up, but a rate of unemployment is not picking up at the same rate. And that also tends to be a structural issue in terms of how our economy works. And therefore, when you're reading the output numbers as well as the employment numbers, sometimes the transmission mechanism doesn't always reflect in those trends. And I think those are some of the things and the reasons why sometimes those numbers don't seem to move in the same direction.
So would we expect to now start to see more jobs going?
Sure. Again, Stephen, my view is that the latest job print, I think, is still conservative in terms of really giving us a sense of buoyancy around unemployment trends in the economy. So I'm still not entirely positive around kind of where trajectory is from an employment point of view. I think certainly given the state of our economy, given the amount of, when you look at all the company results that have been coming out, Stephen, everyone is listing 15 million rand they're spending a month on electricity, this and that. And I think those are all the things that are going to start to trickle in as we start to see those numbers come in. And certainly I think, as I said, is that more companies are going to start sweating their assets a little bit more. And I think that means certainly that a lot more of our employees in South Africa are going to come quite under a bit of, work-based type of pressure. I mean, South Africans are the 7th hardest working people in the world in terms of hours worked per week. Sure. And that really talks to the kind of structural framework that informs our employment outcomes, where a lot of people then are probably blue-collar workers or primary sector workers, where they're pushed to quite a thin part of their working day to ensure that they put in as many hours as possible.
Sure, I didn't know that. We all know that load shedding is responsible for a lot of this. Is it possible to determine how much? And let me just explain where I'm going with this. So, on the most optimistic projection, which is the most incredible amount of investment in solar panels on roofs seen since Vietnam, I think 2 years ago, over the next, say, 2 years, let's say, a lot of the problems we have now could disappear. So what would happen? Would that be like a massive weight being lifted off our economy? Or should we not overdo the optimism there?
Again, I think the energy thing is an interesting one, because on the one side, if you have an economy that is actually pumping through all, pistols in the engine, and then the demand for electricity is going to increase. Right? Yeah. So on the one side, we've got this kind of, bit of a good luck context in the sense that the economy is not demanding that much energy in any case, while we've got energy availability pressure points. So I think that's the one thing. And so for us to be able to fully fund the growing economy from an energy point of view, I think there's a gap there in terms of how we're thinking about that. I think we did hear from the Reserve Bank that they expect this to take out 2% from their GDP expectations, load shedding in and of itself. But again, for me, we don't take enough time, Stephen, to understand the structural transformation in our economy that will inform a meaningful growth path. And so when we talk about then structural transformation is how much should the primary sector contribute to our GDP, how much should secondary and tertiary sectors contribute to our economy, and that will already inform you around whether or not you're creating a broad base from which to grow sustainably. We are seeing tertiary contribution going through the roof, and that means that the structural transformation that should see primary and secondary sectors, manufacturing, come back to their heydays when they contributed 28% to GDP in 1996, that is not coming through even in the investment profile that we are seeing in terms of how the economy is transforming. And therefore, South Africa is going to be more of a services-led economy as we go. That gives me a lot of anxiety around the broad base, and as a result, it's translating in what you're seeing in corporate income tax as well. The base is thinning in terms of how many companies we are seeing with positive taxable net income, and also in terms of concentration of those companies. We've got a big tax-based concentration, and I think that for me is really telling you just what's happening at that level of how do we transform the economy in a way in which we get good building blocks. And you mentioned Vietnam. They had a kind of a government capacity building program that they kicked off in 1976, and they did it again in 1985, called the Doi Moi. And the emphasis there was around how do we ensure that we've got state capacity to be able to ensure industry-led growth. And I think those are some of the lessons that we can learn when they were one of the poorest economies, and now they're the fastest growing Asian economy. And so we really, I think, need to think about capacity building as a key enabler. I mean, nothing came out of the budget, for example, about municipalities and capacity building for municipalities in a meaningful way. These are all the things that, for me, don't answer the questions at that building block level that can ensure that the network industries are able to operate functionally in a way in which they can support growth.
Sifiso, it's been tradition to ask people sitting in your chair, I think for the last 15 years, about whether there'll be structural reform and the difference it would make. That's how, we've known about our unemployment crisis for a long time. In our electricity crisis, even if we were to have any kind of structural reform now, is it meaningless until we sort out the power? We have to do both of these things at the same time. We have to, as difficult as it is, walk and chew gum at the same time.
Again, when we talk about structural reform, what do we actually mean, right? And I think those are some of the things that, for me, is that people don't understand the difference between modernization of, for example, the rail and port industry and privatization. And so when we talk about creating an efficient, integrated transport system, what does it mean from a reform? What does reform really mean in that context? When we talk about available electricity to support, particularly the high-intensive using industries. When we talk about reform there, what does it mean? Are we talking about, for example, a modernization of the PFMA that changes how you procure? Or are you talking about, changing the landscape in terms of how you support investments from a triple P point of view, etc.? So when we talk about reforms, it's first, I think, for me, got to be grounded by meaningful ideological reform of bringing people into the room and saying, what do we actually mean when we talk about reform? And I think, so for me, structural reform in the way in which it's been articulated in South Africa is about kind of fiscal stability. It is about modernizing our network industries, and it is about meaningfully, trying to create a base from which energy can be a developmental enabler from a growth point of view. I don't think that is a clear articulation of how bad the problem is from a structural issue in our economy. And so even those articulations of those reforms, I'm not entirely convinced at this point in time is that it'll have the outcomes that we intend, and it means well, sure, but I don't think it gives a fair articulation of just the scope and extent of the issues we've got in our economy.
Sifiso Skenjana, thank you very much indeed. There's a reason that in some countries, economists are called dismal scientists. Sifiso Skenjana is an economist and managing director at ESG Analytics. More from our continent in a moment.